What was I capable of that I didn't know yet? What about my limits? Could I truly enjoy my own company for an entire year? Was I equal to everything this wild land could throw at me? I had seen its moods in late spring, summer, and early fall, but what about winter? Would I love the isolation then, with its bone-stabbing cold, its brooding, ghostly silence, its forced confinement? At age 51, I intended to find out. Welcome! Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content on literature, history, and politics. I started this channel with a review of Knut Hamsun's Growth of the Soil, a novel about rejecting modernity for life in the northern Norwegian wilderness. I didn't have any particular plan of continuing with similar themes, but with the death of Ted Kaczynski a few months ago, I found myself returning to these ideas. Personal autonomy, rural life, nature, our relationship with technology, and the potentially horrific consequences of modern ways of living for human dignity. In this vein, a book was recommended to me called One Man's Wilderness, which tells the story of Richard Proenneke. Originally from the continental United States, he made a new life for himself by an isolated Twin Lakes of Alaska, reachable only by plane. He built himself a log cabin using only hand tools and lived there alone for 30 years, with only the occasional airmail delivery, hunting parties, and the animals to keep him company. Proenneke recorded his life at Twin Lakes through photography, video recording, and by keeping a journal, the latter of which was used by his friend Sam Keith as the basis for the book. It's a beautiful little book that displays a great love of nature and portrays human independence at its most impressive, a kind of independence made possible by the great competence, the skill, and the talent of its central figure. Unlike the other books I've reviewed on this channel so far, it isn't at all a political book. Nonetheless, it contains important ideas about living, about good living, that I believe thinkers like Knut Hamsun and Ted Kaczynski would be in great sympathy with. So in this video, I want to share with you what I got from the book One Man's Wilderness. Our adventure with Richard Proenneke begins in May 1968 as he leaves Kodiak and is flown into the Twin Lakes by his friend, Babe, a pilot and Christian missionary who delivers airmail to the isolated inhabitants of the Alaskan bush. Proenneke is a 51-year-old mechanic, and his plan is to find himself a nice spot by the lake, build himself a log cabin through the summer to enable himself to survive the winter, and then to continue living there. He will be staying at an unused cabin while he works on his own cabin. He proceeds with his work with great joy, felling wood, carrying everything to his site himself, preparing his tools, and seeing his cabin form together over the next 2 months. The building of the cabin forms the main action of the first part of the book, and the reader will quickly realize that Proenneke is a very skilled man. He creates himself a comfortable home in the wilderness using only hand tools, almost entirely with resources found at the location itself. Once the cabin is finished, Proenneke spends more time exploring the country he now calls home. He hikes, he rows his canoe, he goes fishing, he spots and records the local wildlife, he hunts a little too, though not a great deal, and no more than he needs to provide himself with meat for his meals and skins for extra clothing. While skilled with the hunting rifle, Proenneke prefers to shoot the animals with his camera. Of course, winter soon comes, and he must adjust his life accordingly. This is all part of the great challenge that Proenneke had set himself. He's been in the Alaskan bush previously for spring and for summer, but this would be his first winter, and he wanted to know if he could take it. 6 months of snow ensue, with his lake completely frozen over. He is indeed well prepared with a comfortable and warm log cabin thanks to his great skills as a carpenter and a builder. He does find he has to adjust his clothing to cope with the biting winds, but he not only survives the winter, but ultimately enjoys himself in his solitude and finds great satisfaction in it. The story continues for another summer until the next winter. During the subsequent chapters, he tracks and photographs the wildlife extensively, builds himself a storage cache, and works to look after the environment after it has been despoiled by hunters. He has a near-death experience with a bear and tries to save an abandoned caribou calf. As the book comes to an end, Proenneke makes a temporary journey to the continental United States to see his family, planning to return in the spring for what will turn out to be a 30-year life in the bush. One of the first things that will strike the reader is just how damned competent this man is. Richard Proenneke can build a log cabin with hand tools, build his own furniture with hand tools. He can fish. He can cook. He can fell trees and lumber them. He can row a canoe. Precisely identify wild birds and animals. Forage for and identify wild edible plants. Plant and tend a garden. Make his own utensils by bending tin. He can hunt. He can butcher a carcass. And he can smoke meat. And that's without mentioning skills not directly related to the narrative of the book, such as the fact he was a mechanic in the US Navy and that he could fly a plane. Now, many people watching this video can do at least a few of those things to a reasonably competent level. Few of us could do all of them, and it must be said that there are certainly plenty of people in my generation and younger who can't do any of them. No doubt some of us can do skills not included in that list, and that's fine, of course, but how many skills do most of us actually have? How many different circumstances can we handle? You know, even without any ambition of living in wild Alaska, most of us have a few competencies, certainly, but lack breadth of skills and experiences. Are we thus more specialized? I'm not so sure. I think we're just less skillful, and the consequence is that we are less free. We have less options. If there was some great tyranny in place in Western cities, say, and we wanted to live away from the power of the state, most of us would not have the ability to do so. This aspect reminded me greatly of what Ted Kaczynski said about the power process, the psychological need for human beings to put their abilities to the test and do things, achieve things, create things. Without this, we become mentally sick. Proenneke was achieving something every day of his life in Alaska. He was using skills and seeing the fruits of it. He himself put it this way: "This evening I sat on my driftwood pile, admiring my cabin. Pale blue wood smoke rose up through the dark boughs of the spruce, and beyond, looming huge and majestic, the jagged peak of Crag Mountain. The cabin was complete now, except for the fireplace, and maybe later on, a cache up on some poles. It was a good feeling just sitting and reflecting, a proud inner feeling of something I had created with my own hands. I don't think I've ever accomplished anything as satisfying in my entire life." Another element of the book that really impressed me was Richard Proenneke's love of nature. Most of us say we love nature, and I think we mean it sincerely in our own particular modern way. Indeed, I believe a love of nature is a very powerful force in European people generally, even if it is tempered or in conflict with other impulses. So it's not so much that Proenneke had a love of nature that impressed me, but rather the manner of his love, the developed quality of his love for nature. Consider for a moment the love of food. Like nature, many of us love food, or at least say we do. But for some, that love is mere gluttony. Someone whose love of food is expressed in the daily scoffing of factory-produced chemical prol feed doesn't really know how to love food. Whereas someone who understands food and what goes into it and has a highly developed sense of taste, that person has a true love, a love that has transcended the primal instinct to stuff ourselves. I think this applies to music, to literature, cinema, and probably to all sorts of things that people can learn to appreciate in a more refined way. But before reading this book, it never occurred to me how this would apply to a love of nature. Proenneke describes in detail the natural world around him. He tells us all about the birds, the animals, the fish, the trees that comprise his new home, and his neighbors. He describes them, he films them, he photographs them. He also provides for them and makes them his semi-pets. No merciless hunter, this man. He provides scraps of meat to draw more varieties of animals to his cabin during the winter. He comes to know very well an ermine, a squirrel, even a wolverine, and is able to get wild magpies to sit on his hand and eat meat from his fingers. He does all this so he can get closer to them, study them, all for the sheer pleasure of watching, enjoying wildlife. But it's his vocabulary that I think really shows his closest to nature compared to people in my generation in particular. For many city people today, birds are birds and trees are trees, but for every creature and plant Proenneke comes across, he can name it. He knows what he is looking at, like an experienced and knowledgeable music listener knows what instruments and parts of music he is hearing and thus enjoys his music on an additional level. It's a combination of knowledge and sympathy together that gives depth to one's appreciation. While the sympathy is certainly there with most of us, the knowledge is often lacking. I'm going to finish this video with Richard Proenneke's own words, but before we get to that, I want to say I highly recommend this book to anyone with an appreciation for nature, for wilderness, and anyone who's concerned about man's loss of autonomy in modern civilization. On those subjects, if you're into those subjects, I want to recommend two previous videos of mine. One about Knut Hamsun's Growth of the Soil, his novel about building a new life in the Norwegian wilderness, and also more recently, my video about Ted Kaczynski's life in Montana before his arrest. Now, those two figures, Knut Hamsun and Ted Kaczynski, very controversial figures, in that respect, unlike Richard Proenneke. However, I think all three of them were grasping at some similar ideas here. All three of them felt man, to be free, has to be competent, has to have skills, and that he should be free and should be autonomous, and that he should not be the slave of his own tools and the slave of his own creations. Besides that, I would like to recommend you enjoy the documentaries about Richard Proenneke, which you can actually see here on YouTube, Alone in the Wilderness. I'll put some links in the description below. I do think a man has missed a very deep feeling of satisfaction if he has never created or at least completed something with his own two hands. We've grown accustomed to work on pieces of things instead of wholes. It is a way of life with us now. The emphasis is on teamwork. I believe this trend bears much of the blame for the loss of pride in one's work, the kind of pride the old craftsman felt when he started a job and finished it and stood back and admired it. How does a man on an assembly line feel any pride in the final product that rolls out at the other end? I realize that men working together can perform miracles, such as sending men to walk on the surface of the moon. There is definitely a need and a place for teamwork, but there is also a need for an individual sometime in his life to forget the world of parts and pieces and put something together on his own, complete something. He's got to create. Man is dependent upon man. I would be the last to argue that point. Babe brought me things that other men made or produced. We need each other. But nonetheless, in a jam, the best friend you have is yourself. I don't know what the answer is. In time, man gets used to almost anything. But the problem seems to be that technology is advancing faster than he can adjust to it. I think it's time we started applying the brakes, slowing down our greed and slowing down the world. I have found that some of the simplest things have given me the most pleasure. They didn't cost me a lot of money either. They just worked on my senses. Did you ever pick very large blueberries after a summer rain? Walk through a grove of cottonwoods, open like a park, and see the blue sky beyond the shimmering gold of the leaves. Pull on dry woolen socks after you've peeled off the wet ones. Come in out of the sub-zero and shiver yourself warm in front of a wood fire. The world is full of such things.